The Detroit Lions have an incredibly talented roster. From top to bottom, from the best player to the bottom of this roster, there are talented players. And with that being the case, there are going to be some talented players on the roster bubble this year for the Lions. Players that many years likely would have made the active roster, if not had a starting role on this team, no longer have a spot because of the amount of talent, development, and pressure that has gone into creating this football team. And today, we're going to take a look at this Detroit Lions roster bubble, some of the good players that are on said roster bubble, and talk about how this roster could be constructed with just one game remaining in the NFL preseason. Now, starting off with wide receivers, this is probably the most interesting battle on a position for the roster. Now, I think there are only three wide receivers that are safe on this roster right now, and everybody else is on the roster bubble. That includes Donovan Peoples-Jones, Doris Fountain, Isaiah Williams, Tom Kennedy, Maurice Alexander, Caden Davis, and the rest of this receiving core are all on the bubble. And while some of them will certainly make the roster, and some of them will be starting wide receivers for the Detroit Lions next year, several of them will not be. And in fact, I think this year of all years, it may be the hardest of all to make the Lions as a wide receiver. Now, many people believe that the Detroit Lions will carry 6 wide receivers into the NFL season. They did that in 2021. They did it in 2022. They did it in 2023. So why not do it in 2024? Well, because last year the Lions didn't use their wide receiver 5, let alone their wide receiver 6. If you take a look at the target share between this wide receiving room a season ago, Amon-Ra St. Brown, of course, led the room with 164 targets. Josh Reynolds was second with 64 targets. Khalif Raymond was third with 44 targets. Jameson Williams was fourth with 42 targets, with Marvin Jones being the 5th most targeted wide receiver on the team last year with 10 targets through 6 games. And Donovan Peoples-Jones, a player that did not join the Lions roster until week 10 of the NFL season, had the 6th most targets on the team with just 7. So with that being said, and with that being the case, there really is a strong argument to say, hey, the Detroit Lions last year only really targeted 4 wide receivers throughout the entirety of the season, and they don't really need a wide receiver 5 and 6 because they have Sam Laporta, because they have Brock Wright, because they have Jahmyr Gibbs and the rest of that backfield. The 4th, 5th, and 6th wide receiver options really aren't going to get that much time, and they only truly need 4 strong wide receivers to make a case. With 3 of them being on the roster, the rest of them can kind of split those touches. So with that being said, I think the wide receiving core this year looks like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Khalif Raymond, Isaiah Williams, and Donovan Peoples-Jones. Now, with that being said, that does mean Doris Fountain does not make the roster. I think Doris Fountain will be a practice squad player. I think he will be called up from the practice squad several times and protected on this practice squad several times. He's been a great player and a standout guy through training camp and OTAs. He's been a big play guy. He's getting some reps with Jared Goff, and there is a real option and a real argument that he should make the roster over Donovan Peoples-Jones. But with that being said, his preseason has been lackluster to say the least. I think Donovan Peoples-Jones, despite not having a great preseason by himself, has been more impressive than Doris Fountain throughout the process. I think he knows the system maybe just a teeny bit better. He has proven production in the NFL season, and I do think the Detroit Lions will look to keep him around as their big body dominant outside receiver, with Doris Fountain potentially being the 6th guy if they do keep 6. And then I do think they keep Isaiah Williams, easily the most impressive wide receiver through the preseason so far. Kind of has that Amon-Ra St. Brown, Khalif Raymond archetype where he's a little smaller, better route runner, really shifty, good after the catch, strong hands, can be used on the end around, can be used in the short passing game, can be, create that separation. That is the kind of wide receiver that the Detroit Lions like, and I think the kind of wide receiver that they are going to keep around. Again, this does mean that Doris Fountain does not make the roster. This does mean that Tom Kennedy, Maurice Alexander, Caden Davis, and the rest of this receiving core are not going to be there. But I think with the depth at running back this year, the depth at offensive line, the depth at defensive line, the depth at linebacker, the depth at safety, they're going to want to open up a couple more spots. And I don't think you hold a wide receiver 6 when last year your wide receiver 6 saw just 7 targets on the season and didn't even join the team until week 10 of the NFL season in mid-November. Now, taking a look, staying on the offensive side of the ball, I think the next roster bubble is going to be Craig Reynolds and Zonovan Knight. The Detroit Lions last year kept 2 running backs on the active roster to start the season, those being, of course, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. Craig Reynolds did not make the roster to start last season, and he is not a player that I think will be around this year either. Now, Craig Reynolds was very quickly signed back, and the Lions for a majority of this season did work with 3 running backs, right? They had Reynolds, they had Gibbs, they had Montgomery, and when Gibbs and Montgomery got hurt, they needed some time off. Craig Reynolds stepped in and for the most part did what he was supposed to do, did exactly what you'd expect out of a running back 3. He blocked really well in pass protection. He was a great effort player. He was a guy that, for lack of a better term, did his best and did what you'd expect him to do in the offense. However, I simply do not see a reality where the Lions keep 4 running backs. I truly think the depth on the trenches, the depth at linebacker, the depth in the secondary are so great that they're not going to be able to keep a 4th running back. And if it's between Gibbs and Monty and Vaki and Reynolds is the clear man out in this situation. Really, the battle comes down between who makes the active roster. Is it Reynolds or is it Vaki? And Vaki is going to make this roster every single time over Josh Reynolds or over Craig Reynolds. I know that Craig Reynolds is a fan favorite. I know that Craig Reynolds is a coaching staff favorite. But when you look at the 2 players this preseason, Craig Reynolds has 5 attempts for 16 yards. He's averaging 3.2 yards per carry. And while he is not getting the most action in the preseason, Vaki is, and Vaki is making the most of his opportunities. 10 carries for 51 yards and 4 receptions for 60 yards is phenomenal production for your 4th round rookie. You're not going to release the preseason star, the preseason standout that is Sione Vaki, especially considering you just drafted him in the middle of the 4th round. You don't draft Sione Vaki if you feel comfortable with Reynolds being your 3rd option, and if you don't feel comfortable with Reynolds being your 3rd option to the point where you feel like you have to draft Sione Vaki in the 4th round, that probably means that Vaki is a shoo-in for this roster. Now, there are 2 scenarios here. Either they both make it or Reynolds gets cut. But I do not see Reynolds making this roster over Sione Vaki or, for that matter, getting touches over Sione Vaki in this offense. I like Craig Reynolds a lot. I like what he's done for the team. I think he's a great player, a great leader, a great story. But the reality is he's probably going to be put back on the practice squad and called up occasionally if injuries do arise. Moving over to the defensive side of the ball, James Houston is a big roster bubble candidate, a player that did not participate versus the Chiefs because of an injury that he had suffered or an illness. He was okay versus the Giants, had just 2 tackles playing that off-ball linebacker position, but was graded as the lowest player on the Lions roster by Pro Football Focus from that game. Now, personally, I didn't think he was that bad. I thought he was, certainly out of his element at Sam linebacker. I thought that he was not a great player. On the few pass rushing reps that he got, he looked significantly better, but I also thought that he looked a little better setting the edge. I thought that, his pass rushing was still really, really good. And even though the versatility might not be there, I don't think it's necessarily a death sentence for the James Houston hopefuls. I don't think that just because James Houston can't cover, I don't think just because James Houston can't, necessarily be an every down player, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's not going to make the roster. There are a lot of players on the Lions roster that can't play 3 downs, right? On the defensive side of the ball, you have Ifeatu Melifonwu, who doesn't play 3 downs. You have certain linebackers who don't play every single down. Jack Campbell last year didn't play every single down as a linebacker. You have pass rushers like Julian Okwara, who didn't play every single down, but was still on the roster. You had for that matter, a lot of defensive linemen that were good at one thing and did not end up getting cut from this roster. I think that James Houston is a good enough pass rusher, and I think his setting the edge ability improved enough that you could warrant him being on the roster. And even if he's your third down option, even if he is your third down package and you only see James Houston rushing the passer 10 to 12 times a game on third down only, I would bet that you still see James Houston finish the year with 6 to 7 sacks, because this is the same player that had 8 sacks in 7 games as a rookie. This is the same player that last year in the preseason had over 10 pressures in 3 games to go along with 2.5 sacks. This is the same player that had the sole quarterback hit on Aiden Hutchinson or had the sole quarterback hit on Patrick Mahomes in the first game of the NFL season. This is the same player that had 3 pressures and a quarterback hit in the NFC Championship game after not playing for 4 months. James Houston is, in my opinion, the second best pure pass rusher on the Lions defense. Outside of Aiden Hutchinson, I think he is a more dangerous pass rusher than Marcus Davenport. He's certainly a more dangerous pass rusher than Josh Paschal, John Kaminsky, or Matthew Betts. And I think he is a player that, despite not necessarily living up to the coaching staff's hype, not necessarily living up to their expectations of him being a 3-down off-ball linebacker, this is a specialty player that can get you sacks, that can get you off the field on third down, and that is enough for him to make the roster, in my opinion. If he doesn't make the roster, if he gets waived, he will be picked up almost immediately by any team that can get their hands on him. And I just don't think that Brad Holmes is going to let James Houston walk out the door when he is, again, arguably the second best pass rusher on the team right now. Now, another pass rusher we're going to take a look at is Isaac Ukwu, who through 2 games with the Detroit Lions has 3 tackles, 2 sacks, and 7 pressures through the preseason. An undrafted rookie free agent for Ole Miss, has been super impactful, and I think he makes this roster over Matthew Betts, a player that a lot of people thought was going to make this roster, and a player in Matthew Betts that some people thought was going to start alongside Aiden Hutchinson, I think doesn't quite make this roster. He's had 2 games to prove himself. He's had 2 games to get after the passer, and outside of that 1 rep versus the Kansas City Chiefs, I really don't think his pass rushing has been all that exceptional, and his run defense has been less than stellar. Isaac Ukwu has been a better run defender. He's been a more consistent passing threat. He's been a more consistent pressure machine. He, of course, has better statistics through the preseason and going against the same exact competition. And I think Isaac Ukwu is the better option for the Detroit Lions. Now, again, it's going to depend how many players the Lions keep at that edge rushing rotation. I think Aiden Hutchinson, of course, makes the roster. Marcus Davenport, of course, makes the roster. Josh Paschal is going to make the roster. I think James Houston makes this roster, right? And then it depends how many defensive linemen you want on the interior. But if there is room, and I think that there will be, Isaac Ukwu, I think, is closer to being a lock for this roster than a lot of people are going to tell you or are willing to admit. The last player we're going to talk about today is a player in the secondary. Now, for me, there are a couple of locks in the secondary. Carlton Davis, of course, Terrion Arnold, Amik Robertson, Kirby Joseph, Brian Branch, Ifeatu Melifonwu, and Ennis Rakestraw are all locks for this roster. But I think another player that is going to make this roster pretty certainly, in fact, is going to be Brandon Joseph. Through 2 games this preseason, he has 7 tackles, a forced fumble, an interception, and a pass defended. He's making plays through camp. He's taking reps with the first team defense, and he's getting a lot of praise from both the captains of this defense as well as the play callers from this team. Dan Campbell, Aaron Glenn have both talked very highly about Brandon Joseph. He's showing it off on the field. He's taking first-team reps over Ifeatu Melifonwu in practice, and I think this is one of those players that will be a lock to make the roster. A player that a lot of people going into the preseason thought was a camp body, thought was a practice squad type of player. I think Brandon Joseph not only makes this roster, but we're going to see him be pretty impactful through the 2024 season, whether he's subbing in as that third safety or just playing the role that he is asked to do. So, with that being said, that is kind of my roster bubble candidates and some of the players that I think are going to be in the bubble and, of course, out of the bubble. With wide receiver, I think it's going to be a really interesting battle. If Donovan Peoples-Jones does make the roster, I think that says a lot about Daurice Fountain, who had a great opportunity. If Daurice Fountain makes it over Donovan Peoples-Jones, I would not be surprised. But I think one of them makes the roster, and the Lions carry 5 wide receivers, and they only carry 3 running backs. I think they only carry a couple of edge rushers, but I do think that some of these guys lower on the depth chart, like Isaac Ukwu, like Brandon Joseph, are going to make the roster because, quite frankly, they've earned it. They've outplayed veterans on this roster. They've outplayed players that have been on this roster before. And even if they don't see the most playing time in 2024, I think their roster spot is more than earned. So with all of that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below what you think about these roster bubble battles. Who do you think is going to make the roster? Who do you think a couple of surprise cuts are going to be? Because I'm sure there are going to be a couple. I'd be very curious what you guys have to say down in the comments below. But with all of that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.